loaded with full metal jacket ammunition. And I'll talk a little bit more about that type of ammunition in a little bit. But you've heard testimony that it's the type of ammunition that is capable of going through body armor. It is capable of going through a squad car. It is designed to go through the target and continue flying on for up to 550 yards. Richard McGinnis testified that when those shots went off, he thought he had been hit. He thought his life was in danger. One of the rules that I think most people who are familiar with firearms knows is always check your background, meaning know what's around your target and know what's behind your target. This is true when you're hunting, it's true when you're target shooting, and obviously it's true when you've got an AR-15 in downtown Kenosha in the middle of protests with houses and people nearby. But there's no indication the defendant cared one bit about his background, cared one bit about where those bullets were going to go, and as I said, he put Richie McGinnis in danger. Richie McGinnis, after this incident you've seen on the videos, goes to try and help Joseph Rosenbaum, and has his own video shows when he first gets there, he finds Mr. Rosenbaum's body face down on the ground. And I'm going to play this exhibit 15 for you.
You okay? Just don't move, man. Don't move. All right, can I flip you over real quick? Oh, I'm gonna flip you over real quick, bro. Flip over real quick. Just gotta get pressure on this, dude. Where's it at? Turn around. Where's it at, dude? Get a light on it. Get a light. Give me a fucking light.
Put pressure on it.
Where, dude? Where's the hole?
Get the fucking mask up. He's his head. Come on. Put pressure.
On the police.
Hey, keep your eyes open. You shot him.
I didn't. Let go. Pressure on this shit. We gotta keep alive. I got it. Listen to me. Y'all thinking the hospital right here. Hey, get him out. Get him out. It's not quiet. No, keep pressure on it. I got him. Get him. I got him. Keep pressure on it. Get his arms. Look at him. I got you.
You want to talk about medics, you want to talk about people who care, you want to talk about people who are there trying to help. You just heard them and you just saw them. People who didn't know Joseph Rosenbaum, they just knew somebody needed help. And while that's going on, the defendant flees, callously disregarding the body of the man that he just shot and killed. And as he's running off, he's lying to the crowd about what just happened. This is exhibit number 12.
So there were just like 6 shots. It went off.
The defendant says he pulled a gun. That statement, he pulled a gun, was a lie. It's not true. The defendant knew it wasn't true. He's lying to the crowd as he's running away. Joseph Rosenbaum didn't have a gun. The defendant knew he didn't have a gun. The defendant is lying to save his own skin instead of going and trying to help the person that he has just shot and killed. In exhibit number 3, Gage Grosskreuz's Facebook Live video, he tells a similar lie. As they're running, Mr. Grosskreutz asks the defendant, "Did you just shoot someone?" And the defendant says something about the police and then says, "I did not shoot anyone." And this is similar to the lie that he told Jason Lukowski at exactly that same time. As he passes Mr. Lukowski, he says, "I did not shoot anyone." And that was established through Mr. Lukowski's testimony. And again, I think it's worth emphasizing at this point that Jason Lukowski had just met the defendant maybe an hour. This is about 11:50 at night. Mr. Lukowski got there about 10:45. This is Gage Grosskreutz running towards danger, running to try and help. This is exhibit number 3.
Hey, what are you doing? You shot somebody? Who shot? Who shot? Hey, what are you doing? You shot somebody? Who shot?
Playing the clip over and over again is stupid.
Listen to the second thing he says.
You shot somebody? Who shot? Who shot? Hey, what are you doing? You shot somebody? Who shot?
It's hard to tell what his exact words are. I hear the word "not" pretty clearly in there, as in I did not shoot anyone, I did not do anything. Jason Lukowski, he lies to. The crowd, he lies to. Gage Grosskreutz, he lies to. So at this point, the crowd is dealing with what they perceive to be an active shooter. Someone who has just shot someone, who is still in possession of the gun, who is fleeing the scene, and how are we supposed to know where he's going next? You know, all night that night, the crowd has been hearing the sound of gunshots. They've been hearing fireworks, firecrackers. But now, someone actually has been shot. The crowd sees the defendant running with a gun. He's lying to them. He still has the gun. He's shot someone. This is provocation to them. This is someone who has committed a criminal act and is putting people in danger. It is entirely reasonable for that crowd to believe at that moment that he is a threat to kill again. The defendant could have made it unequivocally clear what he was doing. He could have stayed at Mr. Rosenbaum's body, helped protect him, helped preserve his life, call 911. As he's running, he could have announced to the crowd exactly what he was doing. Told them. He could have fired warning shots to try and keep him away. He could have dropped the gun. He could have raised his hands in surrender. He could have signaled to this crowd that he did not pose a threat anymore. But everything he does is indicative of someone who is still a threat. Now, the defendant is going to tell you he wasn't. But from the crowd's perspective, how are they supposed to know any different? He does nothing to demonstrate to the crowd that he isn't a threat to kill again. And it turns out he does. It turns out within a few seconds, he does kill again. I submit to you, ladies and gentlemen, that in this situation, the crowd has the right to try and stop an active shooter. Nothing to demonstrate to the crowd. They have a right to protect themselves. The defendant is not the only one in the world who has the right to self-defense. Nothing to demonstrate to the crowd. But what does the crowd do to try and stop the defendant? I submit to you, and this is not a criticism of them, but they use almost the least minimal, least intrusive means possible. They could have used deadly force against him. They could have shot at him. But instead, somebody comes up behind him and knocks his hat off. Anthony Huber comes up with a skateboard and the defendant blocks it with his arm. And then the defendant falls to the ground on his own. No one knocked him down. This man that the defense wants to call Jump Kick Man, he's got no weapons, no gun, no knife, no nothing, comes in and tries to kick the defendant in the face. Anthony Huber comes back and tries to grab the gun, actually does grab the defendant's gun, and tries to pull it away because he's trying to disarm an active shooter. And Gage Grosskreutz comes running in, stops with his hands up in the air until he sees and hears the defendant adjusting his weapon as if preparing to fire again. And then what does Gage Grosskreutz do? He reaches for the gun to try and disarm the defendant. Gage Grosskreutz had his own gun in his own hand. He could have aimed it and fired at the defendant, but he did not. And you heard Gage Grosskreutz testify about that, about how that is a decision that he was not prepared to make at that point in time. He is not the type of person who is just willing to take someone's life in an instant, unlike the defendant, who took 2 lives that night, very quickly and seemingly very easily. There is a video, Exhibit 5, which is the BG on the scene video, which traces this entire incident, which we call the second event. This is going to show you Mr. Huber, Mr. Grosskreutz, and the other individuals who are trying to stop an active shooter using what I would characterize as the least intrusive means possible. Someone knocks his hat off. Anthony Huber comes in with a skateboard. In just a few seconds, the defendant kills one person, attempts to kill 2 more, and blows off Gage Grosskreitz's arm. It's that fast. This is someone who has no remorse, no regard for life, only cares about himself. And these folks that are coming at him, the Jump Kick Man, Anthony Huber, aren't armed. They're not a credible, imminent threat to his life. They are trying to stop an active shooter. And they have a right to do so. Imagine if the crowd couldn't do that. Imagine if they weren't allowed to try and stop someone in this type of situation. After killing Anthony Huber, after severely wounding Gage Grosskreutz, the defendant walks away like he's some sort of hero in a Western. Without a care in the world for anything he's just done. You know, it's interesting. This occurs about a block away from the police line, right down the road. If the defendant's so concerned about his safety, the police are right there. And in fact, they pull up to this scene almost instantly. The defendant's got his medic bag on. He proclaims himself a medic. He doesn't know at this point if Anthony Huber's dead or alive or capable of being saved. And yet the defendant offers no assistance, makes no attempt to try and help anyone else. All he cares about is himself. We have taken that video and we have broken it down into individual frames. And I want to take you through, frame by frame, the incident with Gage Grosskreutz. because a lot has been made about Mr. Grosskreuz's motions and what he does and where he goes and things like that. So I think it's helpful for us to take a look at this. So this is Exhibit 80, beginning with frame 356. At this point, you can see that Anthony Huber is staggering off after being shot in the chest. The wound has entered his lower left rib cage and has wound up almost exiting near his right shoulder. It has ripped through his ribs, his heart, his aorta, and he may not technically be dead, but he's going to be dead within a few seconds. He is stumbling away. The defendant has the weapon pointed towards Gage Grosskreutz here, who is cowering, hovering, hiding, covering his head, trying to stay out of the way. And I'm going to go frame by frame here slowly as we see the movement. Now we see the gun is moving down towards Gage Grosskreutz. It is pointed directly at him from a distance of just a couple of feet. Gage Grosskreutz has his right leg planted as if he's pushing backwards, trying to get away. The gun is still pointed at him. The defendant here is going to adjust the gun, turn it over as if he's making some sort of adjustment on it. Gage Grosskreutz testified that this was a movement that he interpreted as the defendant preparing that gun as if it was going to fire again, as if clearing a jammed round so that he could shoot it at Mr. Grosskreutz. At this point, Mr. Grosskreutz is, I think, probably thinking to himself, if I can get away, I will. Until he
Looks like a bunch of blurry nothing.
that the defendant is getting ready to fire again.
It literally looks like a bunch of blurry nothing. I wish I could show you guys, but you know, YouTube community guidelines are already on me. You're not missing nothing though. It's a bunch of blurry nothing.
In none of these frames is Mr. Grosskreuz's right hand with his Glock pistol pointed at the defendant.
This is so stupid. I'm pretty sure if you look at the shadow, you can see that
You can see Mr. Grosskreutz.
Kyle's not actually
backing
pointing
up
that
with
pew
his
pew
right leg.
in his direction. He's
Go
just
back a
sitting
couple
forward.
Frames here. This is frame 444.
This stuff is in the
You can see
Discord,
his
I'm pretty sure.
right foot is on the ground, but it's starting to move back. Now as I move forward in the frames, 447, his right leg is moved back. This is someone who is about to retreat. His hands are in the air. He's backing away from the defendant until, as he's testified, he sees the defendant start to manipulate that gun in such a way that it makes Mr. Grosskreutz feel like he's about to be shot. And only then does he take action.
While the guy is standing in front of the camera.
Does he hold that gun with both hands, the Glock that he's got, and point it at the defendant? No, never. Does he even take the gun with one hand and point it? No, never. Instead, you can see him start to lunge in with his left arm forward. The gun is not in this hand. The gun is in his right hand. He's lunging forward, reaching for the defendant. Probably reaching for the gun. Probably trying to block the gun. You can see now he's going to take a step with his right leg across the defendant's body. Not directly towards the defendant, but across the defendant's body. As he's reaching in, almost swiping away at that gun with his left arm. He has bladed his body in such a way as to try and present as minimal of a target as possible, which is probably what saves his life. His right leg is about to hit the ground here. The gun, the AR-15, is pointed directly at him from just 2, maybe 3 feet away. He's trying to shield himself with his left arm. And as we approach frame 500 here, the gun goes off. At no point in this process is Mr. Grosskreutz pointing his gun at the defendant. Frame 499, the gun is just fired. Frame 500, you see the puff of smoke. 501, the bullet has hit Mr. Grosskreuz's right bicep, severing it. I'm going to continue forward after this because you can see that his right arm, this is an interesting frame right here, 504. You can see that gun. I'll go back even more. You can see that Mr. Grosskreuz's arm with the right hand, with the gun, his right hand is pointed off to the side. What pulls that gun down closer to the defendant is the fact that Mr. Grosskreutz just had his right bicep severed. It's not a voluntary action. It's an involuntary, the muscle is severed. Now watch, frame 502, watch his right hand. 503, 504, 505, 506, 507, 508. At this
Looks
point,
like a bunch of blurry nothing.
absolutely. That right arm is probably dangling down towards the defendant. It's not going to be able to pull that trigger without a working bicep muscle, and it's not a voluntary thing. It's done because the defendant just blew his arm off. But yeah, this is the time after the shooting when, yes, the gun happens to be pointed at the defendant. And I got to stop here for a moment and highlight the hypocrisy of the defense. Because according to the defense, if someone has a gun, they're a threat. If someone points a gun, they're a threat. There's only one exception to that. The defendant. By their logic, he gets to run around with a gun all night. But, oh, we're not supposed to take him as a threat. He gets to point the gun at everyone. But, oh, we're not supposed to take him as a threat. No, it doesn't work that way. The same set of rules apply to the defendant as everybody else. There's no exception in the law for Kyle Rittenhouse. There's no exception that says, if anyone else has a gun, you're a danger, except for Kyle Rittenhouse. There's no exception in the law that says, if you point your gun at people, oh, that makes you a threat and I can kill you, except for Kyle Rittenhouse. I can do it all night long. The same rules apply to him as everyone else. And everyone else has a right to defend themselves also, not just the defendant.
So it was self-defense? Is that what you're saying? Because that's sure what it sounded like. This guy is crazy. Such a storyteller.
We have shown you photos and videos of Gage Grosskreuz's injuries. Exhibit 60 is a video taken right after Mr. Grosskreutz was wounded by the defendant.
Whoever said that the prosecutor is Timon and Pumbaa. That's awesome.
It's hard to look at, but this is what we're dealing with. When you fire an AR-15 at someone from close range, this is what it looks like. I guarantee you, ladies and gentlemen, the defendant had no clue what his gun was capable of. He didn't even bother to pay any attention to it, didn't concern himself with what he would be doing to other people. But this is what happened. Let's not flinch away from this. It's important that we understand what that gun was capable of that night. It killed 2 people, and it did this to Mr. Grosskreuz's arm. When those shootings occurred that I just played for you, what would a reasonable person in the defendant's position at that time think? The good news is, ladies and gentlemen, you're going to tell us. As part of your decision in this case, you will represent the reasonable person, of ordinary and prudent person, and you will put yourself in the defendant's shoes that night. I submit to you that at the time of those shootings, a reasonable person in the defendant's shoes would have known that he had provoked Joseph Rosenbaum by pointing his gun at someone else, that the defendant had put someone else at risk of dying by doing that. The defendant should have known that the crowd was aware of the fact that he had just shot someone and that they felt their lives were in danger. That is reasonable. It is also reasonable to understand that at that point, Gage Grosskreutz had just witnessed all of this. He had heard the defendant had shot someone. He'd heard the defendant lie about it. He saw the defendant shoot at Jump Kick Man at close range, miraculously missing. Had seen the defendant kill Anthony Huber. Gage Grosskreutz reasonably believed his life was in danger at that moment. And he was proven correct, because the defendant shot him too. So when you consider what's reasonable in this case, consider whether or not it's reasonable for a criminal to be able to shoot himself out of a crime scene. When a bank robber robs a bank and runs away and the crowd comes after him, can he just shoot anybody and claim self-defense? If someone comes up to that person and tries to stop them, tries to disarm them, like Anthony Huber did, do they forfeit their life? Did Anthony Huber forfeit his life by trying to be a hero and stop an active shooter and protect others? Is that justified? Can the defendant just kill him? In this case, the crowd was right. The crowd knew the defendant had just shot someone. When they're coming after him, they know he's just shot and killed Joseph Rosenbaum. But you know, not every active shooter situation is the crowd have perfect knowledge. When they're told that person running up the street just shot someone, we don't have time in the moment to go back and take a look at the body and replay the video and make a decision before going after the person with the gun. You know, we've had several police officers testify that in an active shooter situation, their first instinct, their first training is to go in and stop the threat. They don't sit there and wonder, well, maybe it was self-defense. I don't know. I'm going to, wait and see. And every day we read about heroes that stop active shooters. That's what was going on here. And that crowd was right. And that crowd was full of heroes. And that crowd did something that, honestly, I'm not sure I would have had the courage to do. If I see a guy running up the street with an AR-15 and I hear he just shot somebody, my first instinct is not to approach. Anthony Huber was different. Jump Kick Man was different. Gage Grosskreutz was different. That doesn't make them a threat to the defendant's life. It doesn't make their lives worthless. They don't give up their right to defend themselves. They have just as much right as the defendant. I told you I wanted to begin by talking about the murders committed by the defendant. Now I want to go back and put it all in context for you. And that context starts with, bruh, I'm just trying to be famous. The defendant's TikTok profile. 4 doors, more whores. Picture of him up in Ladysmith, probably in early May, proudly holding his new AR-15. Up until August 25th, 2020, this is the only time he'd ever fired that gun. Maybe put 100 rounds through it or so at that property up there with Dominic Black. They purchased that gun on that same trip. The defendant admitted he knew as a matter of law he could not buy that gun because he was only 17. Yet he wants to tell you that he thought legally he could possess it, which didn't make a lot of sense to me. We don't have a lot of defendants come in and say, well, I possess cocaine. I knew I couldn't buy it, but I thought I could possess it. No, it's not the way it works. Dominic Black conducted what we call a straw purchase, for the defendant. He purchased that gun for someone who was not legally allowed to purchase it for themselves. I'm prosecuting Dominic Black for that, as you know, just like I'm prosecuting Joshua Zeminski. Because what Dominic Black did was wrong, and we don't tolerate that. The agreement was Dominic Black was going to keep that gun until the defendant turned 18. It was Dominic Black's gun. It was legally his. And the defendant knew that it was going to be held onto until he turned 18, that he was not going to have it until that birthday. I want to focus a little bit on this AR-15 because I think it's important when you consider the recklessness of the defendant's conduct, how much he knew, cared, or didn't know about this deadly weapon. He'd only fired it that one time, maybe 100 rounds through it. He loaded the gun with full metal jacket ammunition, which I'll talk about a little bit more. He wanted it because he said it looked cool. Didn't seem to know or care much about the type of ammunition or the type of gun. You had a couple of witnesses tell us in this trial, and I could not believe it. A gun is a gun is a gun. Don't even start with that. And a bullet is a bullet. No, it is not. It is not. And anybody who says that is ignorant and reckless, because there are some important distinctions here. Full metal jacket ammunition is capable of piercing body armor and squad cars. And you heard Officer Krieger testify that when they heard someone was running around with a rifle, he went and got his plate armor out of the back because their regular body armor wasn't going to stop those rounds. Ryan Balch talked about how full metal jacket ammunition is designed, and this is a former Army infantryman, is designed to go through a target like a deer or a person and continue on. He says it can hit a target 550 yards away. That's 5.5 football fields. And he explained that he had a handgun that night, which he put hollow point ammunition on. And that's what he was planning on using for self-defense. Because hollow point ammunition acts differently. It's going to hit its target, but it's not designed to continue on and go through and hit other targets. So you will hit what you hit, but you're not going to put the rest of the community at risk, especially on a night when there are hundreds of people out on the streets in a heavy residential area. We can see on that map the car source, there are houses, there are churches, there are daycares, there are schools nearby, and you're firing full metal jacket ammunition around. I submit to you, ladies and gentlemen, that that AR-15 had no lawful or legitimate purpose that night. Now, the Second Amendment allows people to carry guns. That is true. There are people who can't carry guns, convicted felons, for example. But, generally speaking, I'm not saying people don't have the right to carry a gun. What I'm saying is that AR-15 did not accomplish any of the goals that these folks said it was going to. So, for example, Ryan Balch says the handgun is what he was going to use for self-defense. Several witnesses agreed you can't point this gun or shoot this gun at people to protect property. So if you're going to protect the car source building, how is this gun going to help with that? The defendant has admitted the gun was useless when he was going to treat people as a medic because it got in the way. He had to take it off and hand it to someone. So you can't use it as a medic. You can't use it to protect the building. So what's it there for? Well, it looks pretty imposing, and it has some deterrence value, but Jason Lukowski, Dominic Black, and Ryan Balch all said they never actually intended to use their guns. So why is it there? The defendant was wearing a sling that night. He purchased that sling at Jelinski's that afternoon. The purpose of the sling was so the gun couldn't be taken away. Wouldn't fall off, he wouldn't lose possession of it. It was designed to help him retain possession of that gun. And he loaded it with 30 rounds, the full magazine, capable of killing 30 people or more. Why do you need 30 rounds of full metal jacket armor to protect a building? This AR-15 is completely incompatible with the role of a medic. Richie McGinnis testified he's been to demonstrations in Seattle, Portland, Washington, D.C., New York, Minneapolis. He's never seen anyone walking around claiming to be a medic with an AR-15. And certainly when you see someone like that, it doesn't exactly send a warm, fuzzy message. Oh, come to me, I'm here to help. And the defendant acknowledged he had to take off his AR-15 to treat people. No serious, credible medic. The practice of